So let's dive into this. We have Dr. Paul Saladino on and Dr. Ted Naiman on. Both of them have been guests before on our podcast. And we wanted to bring them in to just ask one simple question, which is basically, what's better, a high-fat ketogenic or carnivore diet or a high-protein carnivore or ketogenic diet to produce the results that we're looking for, which is to improve our physiques, to get leaner. This is a vanity episode. This isn't necessarily about what's the best for your health, although that a lot of these things do lead to you being healthier, right? We're just trying to figure out, is there a better way, or are some people do better with high fat and do some people do better with high protein, or is there an actual answer that we can get to? So let's kick it off by having William start out by asking the first question here.
It would be nice as we go into this to differentiate between perhaps for fat loss, perhaps for muscle building, and then also maybe for therapeutic reasons, that protein to fat breakdown. I mean, I think, we are all on team low carb. We're not really going to be arguing a whole lot there, but there is that debate about, a little bit more protein, cut back on the fat, or maybe up the fat, moderate the protein. We hear about people being fat hunters in the past. So just to figure all of this out, I think the whole keto, carnivore, low carb community is a little bit confused. So I think honestly the best question would just be, how do each of you feel about protein to fat macro breakdown? And maybe you can each just state your case, starting with Dr. Naiman, and then Paul, you can jump in there right as soon as he's done.
First of all, I want to just start out by saying that, you said that this was going to be the aesthetic episode, talking about looking good. But to be perfectly honest, the leaner you are and the higher your lean mass and the lower your fat mass, the healthier you're going to be. I mean, fasting insulin is super low in these bodybuilder type people. And when I see clients who are aesthetic athletes, they're in phenomenal health. They have ridiculously low insulin levels. I mean, they're all in the 1 range for fasting insulin. And I never see better lipid ratios, fasting insulin, A1Cs, fasting glucose. And so looking good and being healthy actually go hand in hand 100%. The only time that goes the other direction is when you get into single digit body fat for males, and you are basically starving yourself and your testosterone, takes a massive nosedive. But I think within reason, looking aesthetic and being in optimum health go hand in hand. And I feel like I have the default or null position here in this debate, because basically you could just look at every aesthetic athlete out there to see that higher protein percentages seems to be the norm. And I think that we have a lot of studies actually that look at protein to fat ratios in a low carb setting. I mean, if you look at Raubenheimer and Simpson's meta-analysis of like 116 studies where a human ate ad lib calories and somebody tracked their macros, you see that the energy intake scales perfectly linearly with protein percent of the diet. The higher the protein intake, the less people eat, period. And that goes all the way up to 50% protein in their studies. And literally, the higher your protein percentage, the less you're going to eat. And when they looked at fat, it was completely no difference what fat percentage anyone ate. It literally didn't matter. Eating a higher or lower fat percentage was completely neutral. And that's kind of what we see with fat intakes. It seems to be a very passive, very neutral macronutrient. Like eating more or less fat doesn't seem to really drive anything metabolically. We see huge shifts in energy intake as carbohydrates go up and down percentage and protein goes up and down, but not really so much with fat. So to me, fat feels like something that's just kind of there, but it's not really driving anything. You know what I mean? Even if you're eating fat for like a performance point of view, it takes so long for fat to be absorbed and and end up where it's going to be. It's not really helping anyone perform in the acute setting or even in the late postprandial. It doesn't seem to really make any difference in terms of how people feel or how they perform or how much they eat. And so it's such a passive, disconnected macro from the rest of your metabolism that I feel like trying to go out of your way to eat more of it is just never super, super helpful. And then another kind of belief that I have is that humans have sort of two hunger signals. There's a nutrient hunger that you get for protein and minerals, and then there's an energy hunger that you have if you don't have enough energy. And I think the biggest problem in today's dietary environment is that we are all trying to fulfill our energy hunger and we're not paying attention to nutrient hunger. So as a result, we eat this nutrient dilute food and you have to massively overeat energy in order to get enough protein and minerals. So my style is go way, 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 way out of your way to target protein and minerals and make sure you're absolutely nailing your nutrient density and nutrient hunger. And then if you're still hungry for energy, you can fill that in on the back end. You know what I mean? Like you can backfill energy calories. So my style would be to eat the leanest protein I can with tons of minerals. Like I might eat fish and seafood and shellfish and lean beef and make sure I ate a crap ton. Can I say crap ton?
Yeah.
Make sure I eat a ton of protein and minerals. And then if I still have an energy hunger on the back end of that, I can always add in some fat, or I could even add in some carbohydrate, because personally, I'm just trying to keep my carbohydrate frequency as low as possible. So I might only eat carbs once a day after protein and veggies and minerals. But I could, some of my intake could be maybe up to 100 grams of carbs once a day, which seems to, for me, provide a little bit of a satiety and an energy hunger at a lower overall calories than just eating pure fat. You know what I mean? Like if I just eat lean meat and veggies all day, and I've nailed my protein and mineral requirements, but at the end of the day, I still have some energy hunger. 100 grams of carbs might completely satisfy that for me, versus I might have to eat way, way, way more calories in fat in order to get any kind of satiety. And that might not show up for hours because it takes so long for fat to be absorbed through the wall of your small intestine and go through, chylomicrons and the thoracic duct and all the fact that fat is so slow to show up anywhere and provide you with any satiety. So my style is keep fat as low as you possibly can, and then only backfill it if you really need some more energy after you've nailed your protein and minerals. And that's kind of my stance in a nutshell.
All right. So on the flip side of this, I know Paul's probably chomping at the bit to talk. Paul was here at Super Training Gym a couple weeks ago, and we had a good talk about me upping my fat to get more energy. So Paul, how do you feel about this?
I think that we have to be very careful of the context of the whole discussion. You kind of set the stage in the beginning, Chris, when you said, if we're worried about if it's a vanity episode, the discussion is different than a performance episode. So I think that there's a distinction here between someone who's trying to lose weight and someone who's trying to be eukaloric. And in the setting of trying to lose weight or be, have a caloric deficit, the equation changes. If you're trying to have performance, if you're at the body composition you want and you want energy or mental clarity or other goals, then I think it's an entirely different discussion regarding fat to protein macros as well. So those are totally different discussions. The other thing that is a little bit tricky about the shifting context of this is whether we're talking about a carnivore diet or whether we're talking about mixed macros and whether we're incorporating carbohydrates. I know Ted eats some carbohydrates. I don't eat any carbohydrates specifically in the form of plants at this point. There are a small amount of carbohydrates in meat and animal foods, but it's a little bit of a different equation there because what we know is that either carbohydrates or fat are required in addition to protein in order to function properly in human biochemistry. We cannot just eat protein. And I don't think Ted would disagree with that. Ted has that noted very clearly on his website, that low carbohydrate and low fat is essentially starvation. And so this is the concern I have with the idea of just pushing protein. And Ted kind of noted this in the beginning of his discussion, that you can become too lean. Both men and women can become too lean. And if it's simply a vanity conversation, then fine. But I think at some point, listeners and you guys are going to want more than just vanity. Like, you can get absolutely shredded out of your mind and have your hormones completely tank. And we see this in fitness competitors. We see this in all sorts of athletes. There are plenty of women who are amenorrheic because they're extreme athletes. And this is the same thing going on. You can become too lean. I think that to a point, leanness correlates with overall health, and then it completely crumbles and falls apart when you get too low. That's something that would probably not have been advantageous evolutionarily. And so, these are all of the contexts of the discussion that we need to think about. What are the goals of the individual? Are we talking about someone who needs to lose 100 pounds? Are we talking about someone who, like myself, who wants to be able to go out and surf for 2.5 hours and have mental clarity and have ideal hormonal function? I want my testosterone as high as possible, or at least as functional as possible. I want my thyroid working. I don't want to compromise any of my hormones with my body composition. And so I want to be lean, but I think that for basically the way I see it is that for all these macros based on the individual, there's a sweet spot. I'm just going to call this the bullseye, idea, or the bullseye hypothesis, that that for every individual, there's this range of protein that's probably ideal. And if you push too high, you're going to see detrimental effects. And for every individual, there's probably a range of fat that's ideal. And if you push too high, you're going to see detrimental effects. And also, because it's a bullseye, there's a too low as well. So I think for every individual, there's a too low protein, and there's also a too low fat. And if we're including carbohydrates, then that doesn't really apply. I think just for protein and fat, we have these bullseyes. And I can explain those in more detail. But if we're
whoops, I'm falling over.
Chris's phone keeps falling over here. So if we're talking about protein specifically, for me, at least in my opinion, I would say there's a bullseye range, meaning that for every individual, there is a certain amount of protein in which that individual will function optimally, and that's going to be balanced with fat. And again, the goals are the overarching context. If someone is trying to lose fat, those may be different. But just as a baseline, let's just say this. I think that if we look at human physiology, it's very clear that we can get too little protein. That's quite clear. And there are many in the health space that are advocating very low protein diets now, and I think that's a mistake. I think that we get, sarcopenia, which is loss of lean muscle mass, and we get, loss of lean muscle mass in ketogenic athletes who are not eating enough protein. So eating too little protein is not the goal here. But I think on the other end, we can definitely see a negative effect to eating too much protein. It's very clear that the human liver only has a certain capacity to process urea. And that's how we get rid of nitrogenous bases. And so this is the process of, urea and urea formation and amino acid catabolism. And there's pretty darn good studies to suggest that every individual, and this is individual, and there's a little bit of a variation between individuals, but every individual, there is an upper end to how much protein we can consume as humans, and beyond that, we will not be able to make urea fast as we want to excrete it, and you get something called the maximal rate of urea excretion, which is prolonged. So there is an upper limit for the maximal rate of urea synthesis. So this is the idea of a bullseye for protein. And that too low is clearly not a good thing. And too high is clearly going to overload our biosynthetic capacity for urea and our ability to dispose of nitrogen in the human body. This is basically what's going on with the biochemistry of rabbit starvation. And historically, we've seen this, and experimentally we've seen this. I mean, historically, when Stephenson went into Bellevue Hospital, during the first 3 days, he actually was eating 264 grams of protein per day, which accounted for 45.3% of his energy intake. And he had symptoms of rabbit starvation, nausea, diarrhea, insomnia. And so, I mean, again, without doing the actual biochemistry at the time, but historically and anthropologically, there's good evidence that rabbit starvation exists. We know there's an upper limit to protein consumption in humans, and this is probably due to the liver's limited capacity to produce urea. And then if we don't produce urea, this is turning into ammonia, and then it becomes a dangerous product in the human body. So you could easily get shredded by eating zero fat and tons of protein and 400 grams of protein a day, but that's going to be dangerous to your body, and that's not going to be a good thing. So we have to think about this in the context. The other thing I would say with regard to the bullseye and the fat equation is that every individual is going to have a certain basal rate of fat oxidation. And we know that when people are ketogenic, that rate of fat oxidation goes up. And this can be measured with things like metabolic carts and specific chambers that are designed to see what our respiratory quotients are and how much fat we're burning and how much fat we're actually oxidizing. But there are many things that can change the amount of fat that I, you, or anyone else is oxidizing. If I go surfing for a few hours in cold water, I'm going to oxidize a heck of a lot more fat. Now, Ted has, I believe, correctly pointed out that if you eat more fat than the amount of fat that you are oxidizing in a day, you will not burn body fat. So again, this gets to the question of, are you looking for performance? Are you looking to surf, hit a punching bag, hike, have mental clarity, have optimal hormones, or are you looking for weight loss to a certain point, right? And so if you want to burn fat, then yes, you should not eat more fat than you can oxidize in a day. And that is going to be a very individual thing based on your activity levels, whether you're in ketosis, whether you're burning carbohydrates, etc. But my goals mostly center around performance right now. I'm at the body composition I want, and I want to be able to surf, hit a punching bag, have energy. In my clinical experience working with people on carnivorous diets, oftentimes when people go too high on protein and they're looking for performance, jiu-jitsu is something I hear a lot, etc. They have negative effects. And so this is sort of my addition to the conversation, is that we need to create a context here and understand what we're dealing with. But that if we go too high on protein, the performance will suffer, in my opinion. Now, for some people, that's fine because they want to lose fat. And I would agree that a high protein, lower fat diet is going to result in more fat loss. And we can dig into some of the nuances of what the potential cost of that might be. But if fat loss is our only goal, then fine. But I think most people want fat loss and performance or some maintenance of body weight. I don't know that you or William are particularly interested in losing a whole lot more fat, then you want performance. And so I would argue that there's a real potential trade-off there, that if you go too low on fat and too high on protein, you're going to see the performance suffer, and we can talk more about why. Now, adding carbohydrates into that equation is sort of that's a whole different equation, right? That's a whole different situation, because in that case, you can get calories from carbohydrates that you're not getting from fat. And so the calories can substitute as, the carbohydrates can substitute as fat in terms of calories, and that can increase performance as well. But if we're doing a very high protein diet, and I don't think Ted would debate this, we need to have carbohydrates or fat in our diets, and people can decide what they want to do and how much of this they want to do. But it's really that fat to protein macro, or that protein to fat plus carbohydrates macro is variable with the context of performance versus weight loss in the whole equation.
Awesome. William, you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask Dr. Naiman if you want to touch on some of the points that Paul brought up, especially in terms of there being perhaps an upper limit to protein in terms of the way that people feel. Is that maybe a U-shaped curve? Can we go too high? Thoughts around urea excretion? And I guess specifically in terms of like the goals that Chris and I have, and I think that a lot of people have, are that we do want to be lean and ripped and strong, not out of reason. We're not trying to get to 2-3% body fat, but we want to be lean, ripped, strong, things like that. But we also want to have great performance. So a combination of those two goals. Is there a happy medium there?
Well, first of all, I totally agree with Paul. I mean, he's right. There are some upper limits to protein metabolism. Although it's really hard to run into those. I mean, I have studies in cyclists who drank liquid protein over 600 grams a day, 80% of their calories, and they cycled for hours a day, just literally burning protein only, and they had no problems with ammonia or urea. And so, that they were eating almost 700 grams of protein a day, which is absolutely ridiculous.
That's crazy.
It's really, 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 really hard to run into those protein limits. And unless you have some rare genetic disorder, 99.99% of us will find it impossible to ever bump up against those. But yeah, theoretically, there's such a thing as too much protein. I also agree with Paul completely that there is a sweet spot for protein to fat ratios. And quite honestly, I think the easiest way to nail those is ingesting entire organisms. Like if you just eat a whole cow, you've got this fantastic protein to energy ratio. Or if you just eat a whole chicken or a whole turkey, you eat a whole animal. Sort of the same thing with plant foods. If you just eat an entire plant or an entire animal, your macros are phenomenal. And that's a really easy heuristic for nailing the protein to fat ratios. And so I agree there's a sweet spot. For me, it's kind of steak and eggs, equal grams of protein and energy. And it's pretty much just eating in plants and animals in their entirety. And clearly every single thing on earth is a U-shaped curve. There's always too much and too little of everything. So the answer is always in between. It's always a U-shaped curve. There's always a sweet spot. And it will differ depending on your activity level and your caloric expenditure. And I also think that I'm a huge low carb fan, but I have to be completely honest and acknowledge the fact that any human on earth who's doing more than 90 minutes of high intensity exercise is going to benefit from carbohydrates, period. So you absolutely have to talk about carbohydrates if you're going to talk about optimum performance with any sort of extended exercise. Now, if you're doing something less than an hour, all of us could do just as well with no carbs ever. But if you're doing something, over 60 minutes, definitely over 90 minutes, it's going to be impossible to do high intensity exercise more than 2 hours on a zero carbohydrate diet. You're basically going to have to eat carbs during the event. And so if we really want to talk about performance, we have to be honest about the fact that carbohydrate starts becoming very important if you're doing extended duration, high intensity exercise. But yeah, otherwise I agree with everything Paul's saying. There's a sweet spot for me. It's just eating an entire organism, sort of amoeba style. I think that will always give you excellent macros. And there's clearly such a thing as too much protein. I'm just worried about the fact that everybody on the planet right now is eating too little protein. I mean, literally 45% of adult Americans are not eating enough protein. And so we're just surrounded by this protein deficiency. I also think that there are a lot of people in low carb who they lose 20 pounds, they lose 50 pounds, they feel better, they're fat adapted, they can go all day without eating, but they never really arrive at their goal. You know what I mean? They never lose all the way down. I see so many people who lose 20 pounds and then just stall out hard and they just stay there. They're low carb for life. They're a huge fan because they feel better and they're no longer starving all the time. They can go really long periods of time without eating. They're super fat adapted, but they just never really get all the way there on their fasting glucose and their fasting insulin and their triglycerides and their body composition. And I want people to completely arrive at their final destination with their health goals. You know what I mean? Yeah. And to me, that's honestly, for somebody, I like at least 30% of calories as protein. And you're going to get there if you eat, 1-to-1 protein to energy grams or higher. And I think that should be sort of a bare minimum, honestly. I mean, unless you're just, running a marathon on fat every day, I don't think that anybody out there needs to be eating way more fat grams than they are protein grams. I just don't think that that's going to get people as lean as they want to be or to their health goals.
So when you're saying 1-to-1, you just mean like 1 gram of protein for 1 gram of fat, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, basically equal gram, like 1 gram of protein to 1 gram of non-protein energy, which would be carbs or fats or whatever.
And so what's an easy way for people to figure out how much protein they need? What's the way that you tell people to figure that out?
Oh, I like a gram per pound of ideal body weight or desired body weight or reference body weight or what you should weigh for your height. You know what I mean? Like if you are, like I'm 5'10" and I should weigh 160 or something like that. And so that would be a gram per pound of desired or ideal body weight minimum. So I should eat at least 160 grams of protein a day. And for people who are like, oh, I could never eat that much protein, I'm like, find a leaner protein source. You're overeating fat. You know what I mean? I just think that if once you hit your protein target, you could always add more fat in on the back end if you have a lot of energy hunger. But the protein's got to come first, in my opinion. And that's why I like leaner protein sources. And once you eat 1.5 pounds of meat, you're probably not hungry for the rest of your life. But if you are, then you could always add something in that's higher in fat or even carbs if you're keeping the carbohydrate frequency really low, which I think is the secret with carbs.
Huh. Hey, Paul. So Paul got me eating liver, which was pretty awesome. Started putting that into my diet. And when I put that in my diet, the one thing that I really noticed was I wasn't hungry anymore. It's killed a lot of the cravings. Do you guys think that, I know Ted talks about, eating more protein to fill up and create satiety. Is there anything to like a micronutrient leveling as well? Like we get our amount of micronutrients and that staves off hunger? Because it seems like that's what's happening with liver, but I don't know if that's an actual thing.
I think that's absolutely what's happening. And I don't completely believe that it's a protein hunger as much as it's a micronutrient hunger for people that is connecting with satiety. I think it's potentially both. I think that at some level, a lot of people may not be getting enough protein. Again, we're talking in generalities here, and perhaps we should name specifics, but I suspect that for most people, it's not that they're not getting enough protein that is causing them to have increased hunger. It's that they're not getting enough of the micronutrients. And if we look at, this is something I've beaten the drum about for a long time now. If we look at just muscle meat is not particularly replete or complete in nutrients. And we know that the organ meats are complementary to much of what's in muscle meat. Since the beginning of my sort of exploration of the carnivore diet in the carnivore world, I've been a big fan of eating nose to tail. And I fear that if we overeat on muscle meat and we overeat on lean meat, we're going to be missing a large amount of nutrients. And specifically, we're missing things like copper, we're missing things like B vitamins, like biotin and folate and riboflavin, which are found in small amounts in muscle meat, but not high amounts. And so in terms of micronutrients, I think that that's a really, really big key to satiety. And ultimately what we're talking about here, and again, we have to be careful whether we are having the discussion in the context of performance or whether we are having the discussion in the context of weight loss. And I think those are very different discussions. And throughout both of those discussions, what we want to achieve is micronutrient adequacy and micronutrient probably surplus in many cases. And we want to achieve satiety. Even if someone wants to perform well, we want them to have satiety. And if someone's going to lose weight, we want to be able to achieve satiety in the same sense. And so I think that the micronutrients are key there. I would not emphasize protein in the same way that Ted might. I would emphasize micronutrient status before I would emphasize the protein goals. And I think that one of the key things that we need to get micronutrients is real animal fat, not processed animal fat. I think that there's another delineation there to make for people that processed animal fats, rendered tallow, liquid fats are not the same as real animal fat. I think that real animal fat is going to be much more micronutrient rich. I think it's an incredibly rich source of the fat soluble nutrients, specifically vitamin K2. If we look at animal fats in general, there are some known animal fats that have been measured, for instance, like duck fat or emu oil, which are incredibly high in K2, specifically MK4. And those are incredible sources of nutrients that we should not avoid. And if we are so worried about adding fat to our diet, I fear that we will both not absorb the fat-soluble nutrients and we will not get enough of the fat-soluble nutrients. So I think fat is a key portion of the human diet, and I would actually do the reverse of Ted in this case. Again, the context is everything, and the individual's goals must be taken into consideration, but I would argue that we should look for micronutrients first, fat second, and then protein. Again, keeping in mind that we don't want to dip too low on protein, that there's a sweet spot for protein. With regard to the upper end of limit for protein, I mean, Ted is describing an experiment that I'm not familiar with and I haven't seen the details. I've seen it much, much lower than that. There's a paper that I was reading this morning called A Review of Issues of Dietary Protein Intake in Humans. It's from 2006, and it suggests they give a table in there for the upper limit of protein consumption based on kilograms and based on the mean urea excretion rate, the mean rate of urea synthesis, excuse me. And so, you know, for someone like myself, I'm about close to 80 kilograms. The upper limit of protein consumption for me is quite high, but not as high as 600. According to this chart that they're giving in the table, which is, again, just one source, the upper limit for me is between 285 and 325 grams of protein. Now, the reason there's a variable there is based on a polymorphism or a series of polymorphisms in the urea cycle. This may get too granular for people, but if they're interested, they might find it interesting. There are a number of enzymes in the urea cycle that we use to process ammonia, or specifically that we use to make nitrogen groups into urea. And I know that I personally have a polymorphism in ornithine transcarbamylase. It's an enzyme called OTC. And when we have a polymorphism in that, we are not as efficient at fixing protein into, fixing nitrogenous bases into urea. And so my personal and upper end of protein is probably lower than someone that doesn't have that polymorphism. There are cases of deaths in bodybuilders consuming in the range of, 300 to 400 grams of protein. I mean, it's an isolated case, but if someone has a polymorphism in some of the enzymes in the urea cycle, they could push into that realm quite easily in the realm of bodybuilding. And I think you're going to see performance decline way before that. So personally, I don't really process the nitrogenous bases into urea that well. And then the question becomes, if we're talking about performance, what is the benefit to higher protein for me? I don't see any benefit. I don't lose muscle mass. I don't lose muscle mass at a lower protein range. I should specify for people that I believe the bullseye for most people for protein is around 0.7 to 0.9 grams per pound of lean body weight. Now, Ted was saying 1 gram per pound of lean body weight, essentially. So the upper end of mine is perhaps not that far from Ted's. The only caveat is that I guess I have a lower end that goes down to 0.7 in my mind, and I would not sacrifice the consumption of fat for protein. I would eat the fat first, the nutrient-rich sources of the animal first, the liver, the egg yolks, which are going to be higher in fat. And so that's my concern, is that if we're just focusing on protein, we're missing out on those unique micronutrients because they might not have as high, or I should say, they might not have as high of a protein to energy ratio. The concern is that this protein energy ratio kind of, in a way, shuns the fatty foods, some of which are not great, admittedly, and some of which are natural sources of animal fat that I think have unique nutrients, like we were talking about fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin K2, et cetera, and allow us to absorb fat-soluble nutrients in the other foods that we're eating. So again, that's from a performance standpoint. If somebody's looking to lose weight, I think you can adjust it toward the upper end of what I'm discussing for protein and go to 0.9 or 1 gram per pound of lean body weight for your protein. But again, I would want to get a sense or an estimate, if possible, into the amount of fat that person is oxidizing. If somebody wants to lose body fat, they're going to have a caloric deficit. We know this. But we also know that the amount of food, or I should say the quality of food, the type of food that you eat, affects the calories out. And so it's not just as simple as calories in, calories out. There's qualification that the type of calories that are going in will affect the amount of calories out. But like I said, I want to know how much fat someone's oxidizing, and I'm not going to have them eat more fat than they're oxidizing. But if somebody wants to lose weight, they can do things that increase the amount of fat they're oxidizing. They can do exercise, and they can do cold thermogenesis. They can do all sorts of things that will increase the amount of fat they're oxidizing. But so that's what I would think about. I think Ted and I think about this pretty similarly with a few nuanced differences. I am curious about what Ted said, and maybe he can comment a little more about this. And I guess he did clarify it in his explanation. He was saying an hour to 2 of high intensity exercise. I'd be curious how he defines that, because personally, and in lots of people that I work with, we have not seen a decline in performance, nor do I see a reason for there to be a decline in performance on a ketogenic diet. But perhaps I'm not thinking of intensity of exercise that's as high as you're thinking of, Ted. Like, for instance, I'm not running marathons. I think that's a great way to get arrhythmogenic right ventricular dysplasia and, bad things in your heart. But I am out surfing for 2.5, 3 hours at a time. And so I guess I'm curious, can you elaborate a little more on what you feel the inadequacies of a ketogenic diet are for long-term energy performance, and maybe define the level of intensity that you're thinking of?
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah, so it basically is infinitely variable depending on your VO2 max. So if you're expending, 80% of your VO2 max, you're going to run out of glycogen in about 90 minutes. If you're expending 120% of your VO2 max, you're going to run out of glycogen in, 45 minutes. It just depends on just how all out you're going. But if you look at every elite marathoner on the planet, they will all bonk at about 2 hours, no matter how fat adapted they are. You will literally deplete every bit of glycogen in your liver and your muscles, and you cannot maintain glucose high enough just to really even stay conscious. So there's this really hard limit on pretty much every human when it comes to intensity of exercise and duration. And it's you have to multiply the intensity by the duration. So if you're doing something that's not constantly all out, then sure, you could probably do it all day long. Like if you were just jogging at 50% of VO2 max, if you're fat adapted, you could do that indefinitely. You're never going to have a limitation. But if you're competitively running a marathon, you're gonna run out of glycogen hard. And every single endurance athlete, no matter how fat adapted they are, has to eat glucose during the event. That's longer than about an hour. You usually need about 100 grams an hour of glucose or fructose, or you have to eat multiple forms of sugar, in fact, to absorb, to hit all your transporters and absorb as much as possible. But you're usually burning about 100 grams an hour, and you can only ingest about 100 grams an hour. And you have to have those carbs to be competitive. And we have tons of studies that show that in really high VO2 max effort for durations over an hour, you basically have to have carbs to keep up with everybody else. But I really have to agree with a lot of the stuff you just said, Paul. There's absolutely experimental evidence showing that there is a nutrient leverage. And if you have a human or an animal who's low on iron or calcium, they're going to eat more in an attempt to get these micronutrients. So I think that's absolutely crucial to hit micronutrient satiety. But we also have a bunch of human and animal studies proving this protein leverage thing too. And so protein leverage is very strong in humans. Protein prioritization is huge. And so I think that you really want to make sure you're hitting that. You know what I'm saying? I also agree with something that you said, Paul, that you don't want refined processed fat. Like oil would be the worst. If you eat whole animal fat, you're eating it in a cellular form, and you're going to get all the cell wall, the cell membrane, cell wall protein, and phospholipids, and you're going to get the organelles, and you're going to get this really nice mixture of protein and fat and minerals, and then once again, I'm right back to just basically eating a whole animal seems to be kind of the sweet spot for everything, both macros and micros.
The trick there, I would just jump in, is just that every animal is going to be a little different in terms of macros and micros. We know that like small animals are really not that fatty, and as we go up and the animals get bigger, they get more fatty. So it's like, are we talking like woolly mammoth macros? Or are we talking like, rabbit macros, which are going to be different? So there's a little bit of nuance there. It would be interesting to look at the macro breakdown in a cow. And, I'm not a zoologist, but my sense is that when carnivorous animals, again, I see a lot of things through the lens of carnivory or something thereabout, but when carnivorous animals eat each other or eat herbivorous animals, they often go for the viscera first and will often only eat the viscera, which I was talking to Mike Mutzel there in Seattle before I left, and he was saying that he had chickens and the chickens got eaten by raccoons. And the raccoons just ate the organs and the perinephric kidney fat. And so the raccoons, whether it was time or whatever, the raccoons didn't actually end up eating the whole animal. They just ate sort of the most nutrient-rich bits and the fat around the organs. So, and my impression, though I'm not a zoologist and don't observe lions in the wild, is that when I've seen and what I've heard, that lions often do the same thing. They'll eat the viscera. Tigers, they'll eat the viscera first because that's where the organs are and because that's where the perinephric kidney fat is. So that, in my opinion, and what I know is that's the fattiest part of the animals, the viscera. A lot of times those animals don't always stick around and eat the muscle meat. So I wonder about that. I think that's a great metric. I just think that there are the two qualifications I would make is that every animal at different times of the year even might have different macro ratios, and there's this historical anthropologic evidence of hunter-gatherers sort of shunning the lean animals, saying there's no food there, and only hunting the fattiest animals. I think there's lots of anthropologic evidence that humans were fat hunters and that we sought out fat, eating bone marrow and brain, and that these things played a critical role in human evolution. At different times of the year, the animals are different amounts of fat. So that's quite an interesting idea that, yeah, I think that's true. And I think the macros in different animals are going to vary based on the animal, the time of year. And if we look at the way animals eat each other, they often will go for what appears to be the fattiest bits and the most micronutrient-rich bits rather than the most proteinaceous bits. Again, there may be some nuance there and I may be missing something, but my impression is that the lion doesn't just go up and eat the leg first. It goes for the fat first.
And to make things easy for people that are listening to this, Ted had mentioned his, a big part of his diet's like steak and eggs. So if somebody just takes that advice, is there much missing in steak and eggs? What else would somebody have to add in to something like that, Paul?
I think steak and eggs is a great start. That's basically Sean's carnivore diet, like Sean Baker's carnivore diet. Yeah. I know Ted eats some vegetables. A little bit tongue in cheek, I would suggest that he's not getting much from those vegetables, and that the steak and the eggs are really entertainment. The steak and the eggs are where the majority of the nutrients are in terms of bioavailability. But yeah, I think that steak and eggs is a great start. The addition of eggs to steak gives you a lot of minerals and nutrients, and I think that the addition of organ meats gives you really the magical sort of third piece of the pie. Again, the organ meats are things that people are not incredibly used to eating there, but from my perspective, they do complete the nutritional profile. At least theoretically, it gives us an idea of the things we need to be looking for. There's not a lot of copper in eggs. There's really not a ton of riboflavin in eggs. There's a little more in the white than the yolk. It's one of those nutrients that's a little more common in the white than the yolk. But there's maybe not enough. There's a good amount of biotin. There's a decent amount of folate. But I think to really, again, there's all these arguments about whether the RDAs actually matter in the setting of a ketogenic diet. But I think that if people are trying to eat a carnivorous diet or are interested in eating more of an animal-based diet, I think that the key is adding in the organs. And, steak and eggs is a great start. It's way better than just steak, in my opinion. There are some people that feel really good on just steak. I've talked at length in the past about why that's not my favorite thing. But steak and eggs is better, and then steak and eggs and liver is better, and then steak and eggs and liver and kidney is better. And again, from my perspective, you'd want to think about the macros and the fat to protein macros in the setting of your goals, whether they're fat loss or performance. And I'd want to have some, like Ted is saying, some real animal fat. And I love that Ted highlighted the phospholipids and the cellular membrane components and the organelles. That's, I think, the magic of suet. And the magic of real animal fat, which again is kind of like liver. It's something that we're not even used to eating now as humans. But as we start thinking about things like carnivorous diets or carnivore-ish diets, it's something that people, I think, are getting back to. But I believe that's a very evolutionarily consistent food to eat, is the animal fat in the form of trimmings or suet. And I think that's much better from so many perspectives rather than just like tallow and liquid fats, which are easy to overconsume. And as Ted is suggesting, I would suggest don't give appropriate satiety signals because they don't have the cellular structure that we're used to seeing. And we can talk about fat versus protein in terms of satiety and cholecystokinin and ghrelin. But I do think that real animal fat, as I will call it, is different than processed animal fat. And that processed animal fat, or processed fat in general, can be any sort of oil, whether it's olive oil, canola oil, butter, ghee. Those are all tallow. These are all processed animal fats, in my opinion. And the real animal fat, quote unquote, is like animal trimmings, perinephric kidney fat, the real suet. I think those are going to be very different in terms of satiety. But yeah, I would add those things to a carnivorous diet or any diet that's seeking to get a high amount of nutrients.
I think we're getting closer and closer to really, really practical takeaways for a lot of people that are listening to this. So if we could take that even one step further, I think so many people, you know, when I put up a post saying that we were going to do this podcast, so many people wanted to figure out what is that magical ratio. So maybe if we could talk about what would a grocery list look like for each of you if a person's goal was they want to, you know, have a nice lean body, they just want to look great. They're maybe not a elite level athlete, you know, they'd like to be able to perform well in the gym, lift some weights, maybe go for a run. They want to just look great in their clothes. What would that grocery list look like? And then maybe a bit of a macro breakdown or something like that. If both of you could touch on that.
I'll let Ted go first.
Okay. So for me, I'm going to be honest. I've never eaten liver even once in my entire life. Like I don't eat liver. I don't know when I ever would. Somehow I'm still alive.
It's because we haven't hung out yet, Ted.
Right. But what I do is try to eat entire organisms. So I do eat, you know, like I'll eat a can of oysters or a can of sardines, or I eat a lot of seafood and shellfish, which are animals in their entirety. So I'm eating clams and mussels and oysters and eggs and sardines, and all of these things are basically an entire organism, and the nutrient density is ridiculously high. I also like ground beef and that sort of thing, because when you eat ground beef, you're getting beef hearts, you're getting beef tongue, you're getting a bunch of connective tissue, you're getting a pretty good. It's not exactly a whole cow in a blender, but it's pretty good in terms of ingesting a whole animal. So for me, you go to the grocery store, you buy things that look like an entire animal, right? You buy ground beef, you buy eggs, you buy small fish, you buy seafood and shellfish, and these all have incredibly great protein to energy ratios. They're all super high micronutrient density. The two things you really, really want to avoid above anything else, in my opinion, is sugar and oil. And the reason I pick on sugar is because every other food on the planet has some protein in it and has some essential fatty acids in it. Even wheat flour and things like that has a little bit of protein and a little bit of essential fatty acids in it. But sugar is just pure empty calories. Same thing with oil. Other forms of whole food fat are going to have tons of protein and micronutrients and a lot of fat-soluble vitamins. But your oil might really have nothing beneficial in it than just pure empty calorie added fat. So I'm putting sugar and oil out there as the two worst things for anybody. And then the things you want to eat are basically entire plants and entire animals. And I think one of the reasons we get into trouble with carbs is because we specifically eat the part of plants that are the highest in energy. The plant stores energy in its fruit and tubers and nuts and seeds. And so if all you're eating is plant nuts and seeds and fruit and tubers, you're getting way too much sugar and way too much fat. Versus if you ingest an entire plant, the macros are actually spectacular. Like if you look at the way asparagus grows or broccoli grows or cabbage grows, you're eating the whole freaking plant, and the macros are actually quite good. And you won't get into trouble with plant foods or carbs from a protein energy standpoint if you're eating the whole plant. You know what I'm saying? So I like to eat plant foods that are basically ingesting the whole plant. I like to eat things like asparagus and, cruciferous vegetables. And okay, I know this is an anti-veggie crowd, and that's cool. But I do think that as long as you don't have some horrible autoimmune disease or some huge intolerance, there could be a satiety benefit to plants. Like, for example, let's say, two of us each eat a steak, but then I eat a whole head of lettuce.
Yeah.
Like, I'm probably going to be a little bit less hungry downstream. Yes, lettuce is just crunchy water, right? It's basically, it doesn't have a lot of nutrients. But if I eat an entire head of lettuce, I might have a little more satiety than someone who's just going to have to eat a stick of butter or something if they're hungry.
I actually utilize that technique. Sometimes, like, if I'm hungry, I'll throw a bunch of like shredded just iceberg lettuce, because there's not a whole lot of stuff in it either way, so I'll eat that just to fill up, or some cauliflower rice just once in a while. I don't do it that often, but I'm not really so anti-vegetable. I'll have them once in a while. I don't go out of my way to get them, but I do believe what you're saying is really valuable for a lot of people, because they just want to be full.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm not going to lie to myself and say that the vegetable is really providing me with that much nutrition, but I think it's a bit of a satiety hack for some people. And as long as you don't have some weird autoimmune downside, I think that's good.
Yeah, that's right. I do have arthritis, and but even with the iceberg lettuce or cauliflower, it doesn't seem to do anything negative. So I just leave that in there.
Mm-hmm. Right. So for me, the grocery list is basically entire animals. It's a lot of steak and eggs. It's a lot of ground beef. It's a lot of small fish and seafood and shellfish. And then anything that looks like an entire plant, like asparagus and broccoli and cauliflower and cabbage and cruciferous vegetables. I also eat some low sugar fruit like cucumbers and tomatoes and peppers. And again, I think there's a satiety benefit. Like, you eat a whole cucumber and you're just less hungry than if all you ate was a steak. You know what I mean?
Gotcha. Those lectins will kill you, though.
They will. So let's talk about the plants really quickly.
First.
Oh, no.
So if you look at the research, I can definitely show you guys some studies suggesting there is really no documented satiety effect from fiber. And then what we know is that if you ingest fiber with other foods, this is my problem with plant foods and plant fibers, that fiber is going to inhibit digestion and inhibit the absorption of nutrients. We know this. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that these beloved phytonutrients, some of which are polyphenolic, actually inhibit the absorption of nutrients. So at this point, when you're including plants in a diet, and this is sort of my shtick, right? This is my carnivore perspective, but I'll just add this in as a sort of a counterpoint, that when you're adding plants in, I don't think we're doing anything for satiety, and I think we're negating or decreasing the nutrients that we're absorbing from the food. So I think by adding the fiber in, we're actually going to be depleting nutrients. So Chris, when you're adding iceberg lettuce or cauliflower rice, it could be for entertainment, but if there were a perfect way to see how much of the nutrients in your animal foods you were eating, my suspicion is that you would be absorbing less of them. And so that's one of my main concerns. And in the studies that I've seen, fiber really doesn't have that much of a satiating effect. It's often suggested to be satiating, but I am not convinced, and I have not seen literature to suggest that.
I would just have to say, in all practicality, it's more like when I eat that, I feel like, I ate something else, right? So I think it could just be mental, but I think if it's mental and it works, then it's okay for me. I'm okay with that. But I'm kind of aware of what you're saying. Like it's more mental.
It could be more mental. From what I've seen, and again, I haven't reviewed every single study. There could be something I'm missing, that the fiber has not particularly been shown to be positive for satiety, and it certainly has been shown, along with plant, I would call them phytochemicals rather than phytonutrients, to inhibit digestion, to create negative nutrient balance in a lot of ways. Gotcha. So I would not add the plants in terms of that in that context. My shopping list would actually look pretty similar to Ted's, but just with a few nuanced differences. I would focus on the organ meats, and there's a lot of awesome companies. You guys know Brian Sanders. He has Nose to Tail, which is doing these organ meat grinds where they'll do like a ground beef, and they'll actually grind liver and spleen into the meat, and so you'll get more of those. So you're getting more things. As Ted noted, a lot of ground beef has going to have heart and tongue in it. I see all those as like muscle meat. In terms of nutrients, they're not really that different. Everyone was freaking out about the fact that ground beef could have heart and tongue. They're all muscles. I think the real magic comes when you're getting visceral organs rather than peripheral muscles with your muscle meat in terms of micronutrients. I would construct, I've talked at length, and people, are probably pretty familiar with the way I would construct a carnivore diet. But in terms of functionality, I would start with a fat to protein ratio that's a little bit different. And again, this is in someone that's looking for performance. I would aim for protein in the range of 0.7 to 0.9 grams per pound of lean body weight. And then I would do fat at about 1.5 to 2 grams per gram of protein. So this would be more than what Ted would suggest. While Ted would do 1-to-1, I would suggest 1.5 plus. And people can see what works for them and titrate. But my experience working with people in the carnivore space has been that for performance, generally people feel better when they increase the fat and they don't find any muscle loss. Now, this isn't specifically about the grocery lists, but if people are looking to lose weight, I think that Ted's suggestions are probably something that we could trend toward. With the knowledge that you can go too high on protein. And I think if people are looking for weight loss, you might push it back to like a 1-to-1 ratio of protein to fat. And you might dial back the fat. Once you know how much fat you're oxidizing, people are not really going to be able to calculate that, but get a sense of who you are and what you're doing. But if people are looking to lose weight, yes, things like fasting, which I know Ted is also an advocate of, or at least time-restricted eating, are valuable. And I think you could push that fat to protein ratio to 1-to-1 and do a little bit less fat. Again, in terms of grocery list stuff, I would advocate for a similar type of grocery list to Ted. I would try and eat the whole animal, and I would also include organs. And again, I would include real animal fat rather than oils. So a lot of times I think what people have been doing and what I was doing in the beginning of my carnivore days was liquid fat like tallow. And again, I would recommend real animal fat. So if you're doing 1-to-1 because you want to lose weight, or 1 to 1.5, right, protein to fat in grams is the ratios I'm talking about now. The fat should be in the form of suet or trimmings, which again, I think is something we were doing evolutionarily. We're not used to doing now. And then the 1 gram per 1.5 of fat, the 1 gram of protein that you're getting, or that protein that you're getting, I think should come from muscle meat and organs as well, and things like the whole animal, like Ted is suggesting. So liver, and if you can get it or you're interested in it, all the organs, right? So kidney, spleen, heart, liver, brain, whatever. Bone marrow, I think, is a great source of fat. On the other side, brain is like, yeah, look it up. I actually just got some brain. I think brain is like almost 1-to-1 protein to fat. But so yeah, so a grocery list for me is usually eggs. I just favor the yolks. So I can get more of the fat-soluble minerals. I get suet, so I get the animal fat, which I will cook lightly. I will not overcook it, because when I cook the suet, it turns to liquid, so I'll just warm it up briefly. So I'll do yolks and suet, and then I'll do organs and meat. And again, it's just the ratios are slightly different than what Ted is suggesting. I actually, if you're going to get organ meats in your muscle meat, then a grind is great. I prefer steaks. And I'll do leaner steaks, and I'll always do grass-fed, because I appreciate the lack of fat-soluble toxins in the fat of grain-fed animals, estrogen mimetics in the fat of these animals. So I'll do grass-fed steaks rather than ground beef, and then I'll add a pretty robust amount of fat to that, because I'm in the performance stage of what I'm trying to do. But similar things, and I would eat seafood as well, with the caveat for me that we should be aware of the metal contents of some of the seafoods. And I would, unfortunately, again, it's probably perhaps too granular for people. They just want what works. But I think we do need to be aware that seafood is highly polluted with metals. And I have seen many people in the carnivore community with high mercury levels when they're eating a bunch of sea bass, for instance, or if they're eating a bunch of tuna. So the list of seafoods might be a little smaller for me. And I eat them generally less frequently. I do eat them. I like scallops. I like oysters. I will eat the shellfish. I think they're great, but we need to watch the cadmium. So unfortunately, the world is polluted.
What would you say as far as like recommendations? Like how many days a week could you eat fish? 3, 2?
I would not eat tuna ever. I would not eat high mercury fish ever. It's pretty hope it doesn't sound medieval or draconian to never suggest eating tuna or sea bass, but people need to be aware. Halibut, tuna, sea bass, these are very high in mercury. And if you go to a sushi bar, 98% of the fish there is farm raised, unfortunately. So people need to know what they're getting. So what I would recommend is consuming low mercury fish 1 to 2 times a week, probably. And that would include the shellfish as well. So I might not eat the fish as much as Ted would. I would favor more of the animal-based things, because my impression is that the land-based animals are not as polluted as the water-based animals at this point in human evolution.
Right. Ted, do you track fat at all, and do you have your clients like track fat at all, or how do you figure out?
Oh, you mean dietary intake?
Yeah.
Oh, right. So I try to never track, and I try to encourage people to never track and get to the point where they can just eat intuitively. But for anybody who's not getting to where they want to go, then I encourage people to start tracking their macros. You know what I mean? If you're stalled out or if you're stuck, then you might want to actually track for a while and see what you're eating. The goal is eventually to get everybody to eating intuitively. I don't want anyone to have to weigh and measure stuff. But some people, when they really start tracking, they're like, holy crap, I ate 300 grams of fat from nuts, and my whole day was 60 grams of protein. And I see some when people start tracking, they realize that their protein to energy ratio is no better than the standard American diet. And that's why they're not getting anywhere. And inevitably, in my population, the answer is eating a higher protein to energy ratio. That's pretty much universally the thing that gets people better results. That and exercise. But when it comes to diet, yeah, it does seem to be that's the number one driver.
We may have different populations, though. I think people should appreciate that the majority of people you're working with, Ted, are probably looking for weight loss, and some people I work with are sort of looking to maintain or perform in a different way. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do have some extremely sick people. I mean, I have patients who are 500 pounds or on hundreds of units of insulin and all sorts of crazy stuff. But I do also have I have plenty of patients who are, aesthetic athletes and high performance athletes and completely healthy. And they're also trying to optimize performance. So I have a pretty wide spectrum, but I might be skewed towards the fatter, sicker people than you for sure.
And Ted, you have like these memes that you put out on Twitter, or these graphics, and they have a thing called a protein energy ratio. Can you just explain that a little bit and like how people can read that?
Oh, right. So basically, I'm just talking about grams of protein versus grams of non-protein energy, which would be net carbs, or carbs minus fiber plus fat. So again, like, humans are basically eating to get 3 things: protein, minerals, and energy. And to a certain extent, fat and carbohydrate are interchangeable. When you eat fat, it's stored as fat. When you eat carbs, it displaces fat oxidation. But at the end of the day, they're both non-protein energy. So because humans prioritize protein so strongly, I think your number one goal is to hit your protein target and then add energy in based on your energy requirements, which unfortunately is infinitely variable. Like, if you're just, in the pool swimming butterfly all day long, you're going to need 10,000 extra calories of energy. So it's a little bit artificial to even come up with this protein energy ratio. But the idea is to target foods that are high in protein first, so you hit your protein satiety, and then add energy back in on the back end. You know what I mean? It's sort of like Stan Efferding's vertical diet, where you just make sure you eat a bunch of protein and micronutrients, and then you dump in a cubic meter of white rice if you burn that much energy doing high intensity exercise. So that's kind of where I'm at. But yeah, it's basically grams of protein versus grams of non-protein energy in your food, which is right. Oh, hello there.
Yeah, there you go. On the other side.
I've got a quick question. Some people will restrict protein for therapeutic reasons. And, they're concerned that if they eat too much protein, their ketones are going to go down or their blood glucose might go up. And it might cause some issues there, or even in terms of things like cancer management and mTOR and IGF-1. For both of you, what's your take on higher protein leading to lower ketones and perhaps some negative downstream effects?
Well, I think that we know that higher protein certainly will lead to lower ketones, and there's a whole separate body of literature about therapeutic ketosis for cancer patients or glioblastoma multiforme, which is a brain cancer. So that's a whole different situation. If we're using ketones for that, or that's a completely different situation in my opinion. And I think we know that protein will do that. I have a number of people that I've worked with that I've seen their stuff in detail, and they have a much harder time getting to goal levels of ketones when they do higher levels of protein. Now, I think as we've talked about, there certainly is a low end of protein for people at which they will suffer sarcopenia, loss of lean muscle mass, etc. There also, one of the things I've observed in the people that I work with on carnivore diets, there's a really clear, or there is a correlation between the amount of protein that people are eating and fasting blood sugars and A1C and ketone levels, and also urea cycle intermediates, specifically arginine, etc. So what I've seen clinically is that when people appear to go out of the bullseye range for protein, if they go too high, I do think there are some potential, perhaps subclinical would be the word, negative effects that happen. I do see fasting glucose rise. It's not incredibly high, but it is significant. It is reproducible from what I've seen. And I see A1Cs correspondingly go up. Hemoglobin A1C is a measure of the 90-day average. There's questions, perhaps about whether ketosis changes the life of a red blood cell, et cetera. But I also see lower arginine in these patients a lot, or my clients who are on carnivore. And I think, you're probably eating too much protein if your body's low in arginine, because you have tons of arginine in the protein. I think you're just using it in the urea cycle in a negative way. I see increased levels of urea in these patients. We see the BUN elevate. Whether or not that's an issue or not is questionable, and I think debatable. I'm not convinced that urea is completely non-toxic in the human body. So these things are all correlated, and I think that there's a sweet spot here, and when you go too high, you will see changes in all these metrics, perhaps, in my opinion, in a negative way, and it's going to be individual. And I think that the flip side is that if you can find the bullseye, I don't see a lot of negatives to dropping the protein a little bit, watching those metrics kind of improve and finding your sweet spot and then going there in the future. So that's sort of the way I see it.
Cool. We should probably wrap this up pretty soon, but I just wanted to ask you guys, has anybody ever studied this? Has anybody ever put, a high protein diet versus like the high fat version? Have you guys seen anything like that?
Oh yeah, I have multiple studies of protein versus fat percentage in a low carbohydrate setting specifically, and higher protein always just crushes higher fat at everything you can measure: fasting insulin, triglycerides, HDL, body fat, emotional eating, hunger scores. Higher protein is always better than lower protein, higher fat in or out of a low carb setting. First of all, every diet study ever constructed in the history of medical literature where people ate ad lib calories, the higher the protein percentage, the better the outcomes, period. Always, 100% of the time. There's no exceptions. You won't find a study where any outcome was better eating lower protein than higher protein. And then specifically, I have studies in a low carb setting that was isocaloric and isocarbohydrate, where higher protein percentage always outperforms lower protein percentage. And so we have the studies, and there's just really no question that higher protein is always better than lower for any outcome you can measure.
Can you clarify some of those, Ted? Like, what are we talking about high and low protein percentages in those studies? Because I think that the way you stated it there, I fear, is perhaps a little misleading, because the way we define high and low protein in medical literature is different than people are thinking, right? So let's just define some of those levels for people so they know what we're talking about.
Oh, right. Okay, so there's like a Manny Noakes study on carbohydrate restricted diets where they compared 18% protein to 34% protein. And the people on the 34% protein had half the fasting insulin level at the end of 12 weeks, and they had half the triglycerides.
And what was the percentage of carbohydrates in that study?
Oh, it was isocaloric and isocarbohydrate. And the carbohydrate...
those were not zero carbohydrate studies, though.
Right. That was about a 20% carbohydrate study. So
not a ketogenic study, for instance. Because I just have trouble believing that you're going to have, in a zero carbohydrate situation or a ketogenic situation, that higher protein is going to be better than higher fat in terms of those metrics, because that's generally not what we see. I mean, triglycerides are no worse in people with higher fat in the setting of ketosis. I think there's some confounding factors there, perhaps. Wouldn't you agree with the carbohydrate? We're not totally talking apples to apples.
No, I would not. I wouldn't agree with that. I would say that replacing fat with protein is probably going to be advantageous in any setting, whether it's ketogenic, low carb, or not low carb.
Has it really been studied in a ketogenic setting, though? You're saying low carbohydrate settings, but I'm not familiar with any ketogenic settings in which that's been studied. And I would say that it's probably not, low carb is not the same as ketogenic.
They did not measure ketones, but I'm not sure why that would be any different.
Well, because you have 20% carbohydrates is quite a lot of calories from carbohydrates.
Well, so I guess two things occur. First of all, in the studies where the calories were ad lib and they let people eat as much as they wanted, they just the protein percentage. People tend to eat less with the higher protein percentage diets, and that's where their outcomes are better. But if you specifically fix calories and carbohydrates in these studies, higher protein seems to be better than fat. And I think that's probably because fat, every bit of fat you eat basically gets immediately stored as fat in your fat cells passively. That's exactly what happens. But when you eat protein, if you're overeating protein, your energy expenditure goes up, your lean mass goes up. Things happen besides just expanding your fat mass. So it's usually beneficial. And that's why higher protein does better than lower protein in all these studies.
And what's the type of fat that they're using in these studies? We were very careful to sort of clarify that. I fear that the type of fat they're using is dairy fat or liquid fat or some of these shitty fats, right?
All of these studies use crab foods.
Okay, so all right.
There you go.
All right.
But higher protein does perform better than higher fat in the medical literature, and there's a bunch of studies that look specifically at that.
Right. I wish they would do real studies, or perhaps these studies will never be done, but I'm just not convinced that, this is for another podcast. I think dairy fat is what they often use, or crab fat, or canola oil and stuff. And I think it's highly confounding for all of these things. You know, we know that many of these oils they use are inflammatory in and of themselves. So in that case, that makes, then I think, of course, right? But I wish someone would do the study where they used, like trimmings or suet or like real, unprocessed animal fats, even just straight animal fat. I think it would be different if they used even tallow, though it's not my fat, because we have to imagine, do you know, Ted, were they using dairy fat? Were they using like canola oil? What were they using in these studies for fat?
Oh, I don't know, but I hear what you're saying. In general, most diet studies, I cringe at how they're sourcing the calories. It's usually suboptimal, to put it nicely. So
we should do a GoFundMe and repeat some of those studies, at least in small patient populations with maybe some better things. My suspicion is that, and again, this is just my suspicion, my hypothesis.
I think it's so interesting because we've talked about it, and the whole reason we did this podcast is because I find that half the people in the carnivore space are saying high fat, and half the people are saying high protein. And I'm like, well, which one is it? And that's why I think we even did this to begin with.
Well, the other thing is that, there's like about 1 billion aesthetic athletes out there. Like, if you look at every single Instagram model and YouTube model and every one of your bodybuilders and every one of your aesthetic athletes, they're all doing the same thing. They're all eating super high protein, about 1.5 grams per pound. They're all eating a ton of low calorie vegetables. They're eating just, they'll all tell you that they have to eat a bunch of salad or something to try to, it's a satiety hack. So they're all eating fiber. They're all eating a ton of veggies. They're all eating ridiculously high protein, and they're all eating protein to energy ratios at around 2-to-1 or maybe 3-to-1 in elite, really elite levels of natural bodybuilding. And so why some of these bodybuilders, getting as thin as possible is their job, right? This is their whole livelihood.
Yeah.
If a zero plant, zero carb, high fat carnivore diet got you there, they would all be doing that like crazy, but nobody's doing that. Everyone's doing the same thing: ultra high protein, lean protein, lots of high fiber, low calorie vegetables. And so I don't know. I'm just like,
well, just remember that all these athletes are also hypogonadal.
Well, not necessarily. Yeah,
I mean, I doubt that any of those women have menstrual cycles. I bet that if we measured the testosterone in those men, they would be in the toilet. You know, we're talking about the aesthetic athletes here, which is, I think if you took any of these aesthetic athletes and you put them on a jiu-jitsu mat, they're toast, right? These guys are not surfing. They're not doing anything other than standing on a stage and flexing. And so, yes, it's true that if we starve ourselves or if we create, I mean, this is what you're describing, Ted, is also the situation that you described as starvation in your blog. I mean, they're high protein, low carbohydrate, low fat. They're starving themselves. We know that starvation will result in a reasonable body composition, especially a protein-sparing modified fast, and it will really put a lot of pressure on your metabolism and your hormones in a really negative way. And the performance of these athletes is going to be abysmal in anything other than walking 6 steps across the stage and flexing. Right? These people are not going to roll with me on a jiu-jitsu mat. Come on. I would love to. I'll take 6 of them on at a time.
I mean, I guess all I'm saying is if you zoom way, way out and you look at people who, for whom fat loss is their job, protein's really high and carbs and fats are both low.
But, you know, I mean, as you suggested, I mean, this is on your website. That's starvation, right? So we cannot call that a sustainable thing, nor necessarily a healthy thing. That to me is not the way to do it. That's not a sustainable model for people. If people are 300 pounds overweight, yeah, they could adjust the protein to fat ratio in a certain way to form more muscle loss, but they could also do fasting. They can do water fast. There are lots of ways to lose weight, and they're all just sort of this, like, inching toward this model of starvation. And I just want people to understand that you are inching toward a starvation model. And if you want to be far from a starvation model in terms of performance, libido, hormones, metabolism, that you won't cross that line as abruptly or as fervently as many of these people are doing.
But wouldn't the answer there be sort of to find the middle of the way approach where you are utilizing some of the concepts of maybe protein to energy ratio, but not so much in a way that you would cause yourself to become hypogonadal or, you know, be extremely low carb, low fat and get some of those negative effects. Maybe it would be something closer to 1-to-1 or something like that.
It depends on your goals. I mean, if we're talking about you, William, for instance, it depends what you want to do, you know? If you wanted to get into, like, you know, do your martial arts again or do jiu-jitsu or something, I suspect you would feel better and maintain the same body composition with higher fat.
I'm thinking mostly in terms of like that person who is 300 pounds who, you know, really wants to cut down.
Well, that's a different situation, right? That's a unique situation. That is somebody that wants to lose weight. So somebody that's 300 pounds that wants to lose weight can do that by achieving a caloric deficit. And that caloric deficit can be achieved in many ways. That caloric deficit can be achieved. And ultimately, the easiest way to achieve that caloric deficit is going to be satiety. And as we talked about earlier, I think the keys to satiety are micronutrients first, and then getting in, you know, having the energy that's lower than what you need. So I think that satiety is micronutrients and then perhaps protein. Ted might disagree and say protein is first, but I think that satiety is the way you're going to do it. I think someone could lose weight from 300 pounds on a higher fat diet, absolutely. And there's never been a study to show sort of how you could construct that and how the hormones would go and how they would feel and how their sleep would be and all these things would happen. you can also have someone lose weight from 300 pounds just by fasting. I mean, that person could just do a water fast for a month and a half and they'll lose the weight very quickly. So the whole conversation just needs to be couched in like, what are we trying to achieve? How fast do we want to get there? What are we willing to sacrifice along the way? And that there are many ways to do this, but ultimately it's about satiety. And I think that for the biggest thing for satiety is going to be micronutrients. Protein is going to be satiating. I don't think it's the only thing that's satiating. We didn't really have time to get into the studies on CCK and ghrelin. I think that real animal fat is going to be very satiating for people in similar ways. So, and as we talked about, I think many of the studies that have been done are confounded by the fact that they're in the setting of higher carbohydrate diets and perhaps use of very poor quality fat. There's never been a great study there. But yeah, certainly if somebody wants to lose weight from 300 pounds, eating a higher PE ratio is going to do that. There is a ceiling there as well. You can go too far, I believe, and you can really have detrimental effects on your metabolism and your hormones, et cetera. So the idea is, how do you do it most sustainably? How do you do it in the most healthful way? How do you do it in the way that's going to give them the most micronutrients long term? But I think, all three of us, we're performance athletes. We're not trying to lose weight. So this is a performance-based podcast, is the performance aesthetics? I would argue performance is much more than aesthetics, right? You get to a certain body composition and you want to look good, but you also want to be able to do shit.
Yeah. I mean, when I say aesthetics, I just meant like I'm still trying to get to my goal. I'm still trying to get to where I was originally going. So my performance doesn't matter to me as much as maybe it does to you guys.
Fasting, Chris, fasting.
I think so. I think that's like the last step is like, I'm trying to break through a set point, and I think it takes something extreme or different, I think.
Well, I mean, there's actually some good anecdotal evidence, I think, from Jason Fung and others who've done lots of fasting for people that in terms of autophagy and, things like this, that fasting is key. And I mean, I think there's going to be lots of autophagy on a ketogenic diet in general, but I think that fasting might be one of the things to employ for you specifically.
Absolutely. William, you have anything else? We'll let these guys go enjoy their day.
Really, really interesting, because I think you're both right. And maybe the key takeaway for a lot of people listening is, what can I actually do? What can I really, really stick to? And I think that a lot of people listening that want to drop, I think maybe 90% of the people listening might not be the performance-based athletes, but might be the people that want to drop the last 10 to 15 pounds after losing maybe 20 plus pounds on keto or low carb or carnivore. And maybe the takeaway is, what can I really do? So some of those people will be able to eat the organ meats and to increase the fat and to stick with suet. And I think some of the people might not want to do that, and they might want to go with more like steak and eggs and prioritizing protein, eating seafood, shellfish, things like that. So ultimately, if there's no practical takeaways, then the discussion's pointless. So for people that are listening, find within those grocery list templates, we're kind of arguing a lot in the weeds just because we find it interesting. But to people that are listening, find that grocery list for yourself that incorporates the best from both of these approaches. Use that, make it work for you. Because I mean, Paul's got a six-pack, Ted's got a six-pack. These guys have hit their goals. If you're looking to hit your goals, incorporate, what you think will work for you within that structure.
I think you also have to keep track of other metrics. The six-pack is not the only metric, track thyroid hormone, track fasting blood glucose, track your lipids, track your testosterone, track your cortisol, track your sleep, track your libido. There's many other metrics here. People want to get really granular, get an organic acids test, look at your blood urea, work with somebody, look at your uric acid. It's complex, it's not as simple as just, lose the weight. There's complexities here, I think. There's some nuance, and the way we get there matters, in my opinion.
Yeah,
awesome.
I feel like in the same vein, I feel like a lot of people simply won't do that. I'm just thinking about if my mom or dad was listening to this podcast and they were like, okay, you know what? I want to do something to improve my health long term. And I know that, it's going to go in one ear, out the other. But if they could just take away 20% that can influence the other 80%, and I know for them that they're not going to do all of these things, perhaps for them it might just be, okay, well, let me drop the weight by incorporating these foods. And that's far better than where they were at before.
Absolutely. But I don't think we should invalidate the fact that there's nuance there. either, you know?
Absolutely not invalid.
We can't distill it down too far, because then you lose the fact that there is nuance there.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris,
I do want to say one thing that, like, you know, when a lot of people are worried about eating this or that because of their IGF-1 or their mTOR activation, or the reality is, if you want lower insulin, IGF-1, mTOR activation, triglycerides, blood sugar, A1C, if you want all this stuff to be lower, you need to just be thinner. Seriously, like what you eat is nowhere near as important as just walking around 24 hours a day at a lower body fat. So for people who are afraid to eat protein because it's going to, you know, stimulate mTOR, raise IGF-1, try just being thinner all day, every day, 24/7, 365. You're going to get way less activation of all of that stuff. And so I just don't want people to be afraid of eating protein. I also want everybody out there to know that all of these things are levers for fat loss. You know, eating low carb is a lever for fat loss. Eating higher protein is a lever for fat loss. Targeting micronutrient density is a lever for fat loss. High intensity exercise is a lever for fat loss. And I hate to say it, but eating less fat is a huge lever for fat loss. And that's why all these aesthetic athletes are doing that. So, you know, I just don't want anybody to get stuck in a low carb echo chamber where they think that eating more fat is going to make them thinner, because the entire rest of the planet, basically low carb's a laughing stock, because we have told people to eat more fat when basically eating fat, dietary fat is stored as body fat. And so eating more fat is probably not going to make anybody fitter. You know what I mean?
But again, remember that I would also say that I think the context matters, and the quality of that fat matters as well. I mean, if we're talking about pushing butter and olive oil down people's throats, not a fan, but I think that real animal foods are different in that space. And I just don't believe that eating more real animal fat in an intentional way is going to make someone fatter, all things being equal otherwise, and, you know, a reasonable diet otherwise.
We need the GoFundMe studies.
Yeah, we do.
So cool, man. Well, thank you guys so much for doing this. This was awesome. I know I got a lot out of it. Hopefully William did too, and hopefully the people listening got a lot out of it.
Yeah, thank you guys both for the time.
For sure.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Do you guys have any last words, Paul?
People, I'm going to tell people where I'm at, bro. People can find me. Fundamental Health Podcast. I've got a podcast. I interview all sorts of people. Ted hasn't been able to come on the show yet because he's dodging me, and he won't.
Well, I would love to hear that. So Ted, you have to do it now.
Amazing part.
Ted will come on my show maybe soon. But I've got a podcast, which is Fundamental Health. My website is Paul Saladino MD, where people can find links to my newsletter and all my other stuff. I'm on Instagram at Paul Saladino MD. All kinds of stuff going on. I work with people virtually, and I have clients, functional medicine clients all over the world. So
yeah, and I should say that you've been a huge help to me in everything I'm doing, so thank you.
I'm glad,
really
man.
Appreciate
for sure
it.
Yeah, totally.
And Dr. Ted's been a huge help to my dad, who I told him before we got on the air. My dad has been following a lot of Ted's stuff and really likes it, and has really been digging into that stuff. So thank you as well. And where can we find you?
Well, yeah, I only see patients in person in the clinic here in Seattle. I'm just a primary care doctor for a major medical center in Seattle. But you can check out my website at Burn Fat Not Sugar. And I'm on Twitter and Facebook and that kind of thing too.
Awesome.
You guys are both doing incredible stuff. Literally, both of you are in our top 3 Bigger, Stronger, Faster podcasts. So
we love it.
People are listening to what you guys are saying. So I hope everybody took a lot of value out of this, and we'll talk to you guys soon.
Yeah. So this episode should be number 1 then, if we're both in the top 3.
Yeah, we'll smash it.
We'll crush it.
All right, guys. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Peace out.
We're out. Later.